Almost by definition, 7 years ago, it's a lot easier to start a fintech companies because the financial services companies were busy with their core business. And frankly, it's not in their best interest to innovate 7 years ago, right? Why, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So 7 years ago, they had no reason to innovate. But today, they have strong incentive to innovate. I came from corporate background. I used to handle corporate investments for two large international multinationals. And I kind of gauge the level of innovation of a corporate based on a very simple principle or very, very simple rule. 5-10 years ago, a lot of these corporates start hiring chief innovation officer. If there's such a title in the company, that means they're thinking, hey, we actually have to have an innovation group. Not to be confused with R&D, right? Research and development historically is they think it's strategic, but I actually think it's a little bit tactical because R&D has a very important role of making sure the product and services stays on the roadmap. They oftentimes don't have the responsibility of the burden of thinking about what if there is this weird thing that happens. It's more of a linear progression. They don't have to think about, well, what if we get rid of banks? No, none of the R&D department of a bank would think about that, right? At least 10 years ago. Or if you work for Nokia 10 years ago, you don't think about what if they get rid of the phone? But in fact, we did get rid of the phone, right? We now have this mini iPad mini computer in our pocket that happen to have an audio capability. Chief Innovation Officer can be found in most financial services company now. So I think today, compared to 7 years ago, it is much harder for fintech startups to compete. It's just, there's no two ways about it. It's natural, it's good for consumers, and we're approaching sort of the peak of fintech adoption, right? How do they compete? I'm biased towards startups, right? I think startups are resilient, and they typically can find a entry point and land and expand. Big companies focus on big pictures. They typically focus on large issues, and by definition, when they focus on something, they will leave these little cracks behind. So my advice to startups is find a entry point that is not in the direct line of the battlefield. Go through the flank, go attack that one very specialized market, but have a strong vision and communicate well what the end game is. So I always ask our entrepreneurs two questions. What is your 1-year goal? What is your 10-year goal? At the end of 1 year, I want you to have a product in this small niche market that's not interesting for JP Morgan, too small. But I want you to do that, to get into the customer's preferred vendor list, to get on consumer's phone with your app, whatever it is, have a foothold. But obviously, I want you to have a 10-year vision that is much bigger. Otherwise, what's the point? We did a study, you make a hell of a lot more money and even more rewarding if you go work for Facebook, Google, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs. You do startup not because you think you're going to make money short term, right? You do a startup because you want to change the world. You want to make the world a better place. You want to fulfill a personal dream. And as a byproduct, your expected value for what you would make 10 years from now is much larger than anything else you do as a byproduct. But probabilistically speaking, the odds are against you. It's just the outcome is so big if you do quote unquote get lucky, or I should say, if you do quote unquote earn your luck by working hard, right? You actually do make more money, end up making more money. So that's a byproduct. I try to keep things very simple at the seed stage. Two things. One, I want to see a very, very large market that the companies going after in the 10-year term. Very large market, right? Two, the people are the right people to go after that market. That's all. Keep it very simple. Everything else, there are some detailed questions stem from these two observations, but if you clear those two, generally, I'm very interested. But you say, well, that's so easy. You must fund lots of companies. We actually don't. We probably have a pretty high deal velocity compared to our peers. We'll probably invest in 20 to 30 startup companies a year as a firm. But to clear those two check boxes, there are sub boxes. It's actually not that easy. But we do try to keep it very simple so we ourselves don't get confused, right? Because otherwise, you don't want to get into a situation where, well, what about this? What about that? We'll just keep it very simple so we won't lose a big picture. And our strategy of this simple market and people evaluation process is based on 30 years of data and correlation. We go back and look at the data and we discover the kind of people who change the world oftentimes also makes the most money, So it definitely is something that we've noticed, but by looking at data. 2021 really is a strategic inflection point for startups. I think the startups are lucky. The startups that have a product are very lucky because I think they have found a pretty willing audience. And I'm speaking generally. Tech startups in this environment, very easy to find new customers. The people who are even luckier are the ones that are starting a business now, because this is next 10 years, how you would design a new business is very different from the last 10 years. So if you have a chance to restart your business now, I think your business plan might look very differently compared to if you started a business with a plan 3 years ago. So take advantage of it. Don't let the crisis go to waste.